Hello, everybody. We've just opened the doors to the webinar, and we will just wait for attendees to come in. And I'm going to give it a quick minute while you all fill up is it the lobby or the waiting room? I'm never really sure what we call it. I guess it's the seats, the virtual seats for the webinar stuff. And I hope we are all cool today because it's a really, really hot day where we are, and we were just talking about how it seems to be hot all over Scotland today. So if I'm getting a little bit warm as we go through this presentation, you could understand why. The window right here, 28 degrees heat coming right out of it. I hate to think what temperature my computer is currently sitting at as well. So if I just suddenly disappear, everyone else that's in the webinar series, you know what's happened. My computer has melted. So as you all come in, I'm going to move into presenting my screen so you can see this. So welcome everyone as you come in to the webinar series, Making Rights Real with Arc Scotland and Partners. This webinar is part of a follow-on from the Hear Our Voices, Respect Our Choices event that I will explain a little bit more about as we go through. So before we go into the webinar series itself, you'll notice we are on a Zoom webinar. So if you have questions, there is a chat function and a Q&A function and you should have a raise your hand function at the bottom of the screen. So if you have any questions as we go through today's webinar, ideally put them into the Q&A box by asking a question. If they go into the chat and the chat is a little bit lively, they can be missed. And so it's really good that they go into the Q&A part. You might not see your question appear in the Q&A, but we can all see your question. And when it's answered, you'll see it move across. Also, just to let you all know that the webinar is being recorded. If you are an attendee to the webinar, we can't see your faces, we can't see who you are, and we can't hear your voice. On the back of that, if you want to ask a question, ideally in the Q&A as we go through, if you want to, you can also raise your hand to ask a question in person, but just be aware if you do that, your voice and potentially your face will appear on the recording, because there's not much I can do about that for you unless you kind of reach out to me afterwards and I can kind of blur it out and make you look a bit kind of like, who is that mysterious person asking those questions? So just be aware. So yeah, a little bit about Arc Scotland for those who might not know who we are and what we do. So Arc Scotland is an organisation that focuses on networks and bringing people together. This webinar series has been organised by the Scottish Transitions Forum, which myself and Tracy and my colleague Beck work on. And as it says on the tin, we focus on transitions, funny enough. ARC also run the Supporting Offenders with Learning Disabilities and Autism Network. Again, does what it says on the tin. They're also the National Involvement Network, which makes sure that people who have learning disability or autism are involved in the care that they receive from the third sector organisations. So that involves things like the Charters for Involvement and the charter statements that mean or have been developed by the people within them to make sure that they are within the boards of companies and all of this kind of stuff. So involvement is at the heart of what they do. We are also a SQA approved training centre. So we develop and deliver training across all of the kind of health and social care fields, and also bespoke training for organisations. And we also run a young person's leaders group, I guess, called the Divergent Influences that some of you might know, and a parent and carers network that some of you might be involved in, some of you today are from. And we also are currently undergoing a trial about getting transitions right for the whole of Scotland, called the Principles into Practice framework, and part of that is a piece of software called Compass, but we're not going to talk about that today. Jeanette, I hear that you've got or see that you've got your hand up. I'm going to allow you to talk if that's okay, or if you want to type in the chat if that's something that you want to do. Jeanette, you can chat if you turn your microphone off, on even.
I didn't mean to put my hand up. I'm on my phone and I must have pressed something. But yes, I know I wasn't wanting to say anything. Sorry.
Okay, it's cool. Nice that you're here, Jeanette.
Nice. Thank you.
I'll put your hand down.
What happened?
Cool. That is how the function when you raise your hand and you're out to talk works. So thank you for that example, Jeanette. That's really good. So yeah, this is what Uncrc do. So basically bringing people together. And this part of the webinar series came off the back of an event that was held in end of March. Was it, Tracy? It feels like a year ago. It was only this year.
It was the beginning of March, actually, Scott, beginning of March at Dynamic Earth in Edinburgh.
Yeah, thank you. So it feels like years ago now, actually. It feels so long. Called Hear Our Voices, Respect Our Choices. And when you would have seen the Eventbrite link, there was a wee video about the kind of content that this part of the webinar follows from. And particularly, it was based around lots of things that parents and carers thought were really, really important to have conversations about. So in terms of the conversations we had on that day, they were very far-ranging and very, not top level, but really kind of looking at like the principles behind things and the ideas and stuff. So we are putting on these webinar series to delve deeper into the different issues that you wanted us to kind of bring to you to talk about. And hence why we have the people that we have today that are going to be part of the webinar. So this is an opportunity to hear from Jennifer from the Govan Law Centre, and Sarah Jane from Partners in Advocacy, and Karen Mckenzie from Thriving Families, who's also a parent of a young person. And what they're going to do is they're going to talk about examples and things and legislation probably, and examples of how people that they all know have had and have made their rights real through the course, not just of transition, but rest of life potentially, but a focus on transition. So the way that we're going to roll today is there will be a conversation or a presentation / conversation between Jennifer and Sarah Jane, SJ from Partners in Advocacy. When they're done, we'll pass over to have a conversation with Tracy and Karen Mckenzie all around rights, and then that will be followed by a kind of Q&A panel. So any of the questions that you've raised in the course of the webinar, that will be an opportunity to answer them then, or you can just do what Jeanette did and ask to raise your hand, because it's like webinar classroom, and we'll come to you and you get to ask your question in person. So that is me. I'm only here to introduce everyone, and then what I'm going to do is I'll keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A function for everyone, just so you know that someone's paying attention to that. And then I'm going to happily now pass over to Jennifer and SJ. So thanks so much. I'm just going to turn off my camera, but know that I'm in the background lurking if you need anything. Okay.
Hello everyone. Yeah, my name's SJ. Sarah Jane's my full name, and when I get that I feel like I'm getting into trouble. So thank you for coming along, and thank you to Scott and Uncrc Scotland for letting us come along. Myself and Jennifer are going to talk a little bit about the rights that we deal with in our day-to-day work, me from the young person's perspective and Jennifer from sometimes parents or older young people's perspective. So I'm just going to share a presentation with you just now. And this is where the technology sometimes is not my friend and doesn't work. So I'm just going to ask somebody to check that it is working. Let's try this. Ta-da! Can everyone see this okay?
I'm seeing that. Yeah, that looks
perfect.
Good.
Thank you so much. So yeah, my name's Sarah Jane Cruz, and as I said, it's SJ. Please feel free to, you know, as Scott said, drop any questions or anything you've got. I know sometimes when I get right into talking about my work and the passion that I have for it, I can get quite technical, and actually it's about bringing it back to sort of real life examples and what it is our work actually does. So I work for Partners in Advocacy, which is an advocacy organisation, and we help broadly across the board, children and young people, adults, lots of different services. But what we do is we help people have their voices heard and to make sure that their rights are being upheld. So yeah, to start off with, just a broad sort of slide on rights, if you like. So human rights do encompass the most basic rights of freedoms that belong to every single human being on the planet, regardless of any, race, gender, religion, ethnicity. The way that we explain it to young people is that, we all look different, believe in different things and want different things and, behave in different ways. But we are all humans, which means we have the same rights. There are children's rights under the Uncrc that are, protected for children, and that they enable all children to be protected, valued and heard. So there's some aspects of more specialised rights under different legislations, and that gives people more choice on what's going on for them in these specific situations. And the rights I'm going to talk to you about today are within let me get this right because it's a long-winded one, the Education Additional Support for Learning Scotland Act 2004 as amended, which extended education rights to some children to help them get more support within their education. So this is about the rights of children with additional support needs aged 12 to 15 within My Rights, My Say. So in the 10th of January 2018, the rights of children aged 12 to 15 were extended to give them a lot of same rights as their parents or carers, and the rights that young people get when they turn 16 under the Additional Support for Learning legislation. So I'll give you more concrete examples on the next slide of what it is that children and young people can do with these rights. But just generally, they have the right to ask the school or local authority to find out if they need extra support. They have the right to have their say in plans. They have the right to have advocacy at meetings about their additional support needs, and to have advocacy to share their views, question the plans, or make or appeal a decision if they're unhappy with what's happened. And they have the right to be more involved within that, remit, within resolving disagreements about their support, or if things aren't going quite right in school. I mean, there are caveats to this, that, the local authority needs to assess the capacity of the child. And that's because these are rights that children and young people have, but they need to understand what it is that they're asking for. So, for example, if a young person is asking for an assessment, they need to understand that that might mean that someone's going to come in and assess, say they're asking for, a dyslexia assessment that's going to assess their writing and what's going on for them, and maybe chat to their teachers. And just, they don't need to understand the legislation or anything in depth, but they do need to understand that that will be a process. And the other caveat to using these rights is that it doesn't adversely affect their well-being. So say a young person is going through real mental health difficulties, and actually exercising their rights is really upsetting them and worsening their mental health medically, that wouldn't be something that they could continue with, and the rights would then fall back to their parents. Now, one important thing I should say is, just because these rights are extended to children and young people, it doesn't stop parent or carers' rights. The two rights can be used simultaneously when giving views. The only thing it can't happen is exercising the exact same rights when it comes to statutory stuff, like applying for a plan or an assessment. That would need to be, either a parent or a child that uses it. So I'll let you kind of know a little bit more about what it is that children and young people with additional support needs can ask for, what these rights entail. So it means that, if we start with the top left-hand box, it means that they have the right to ask their local authority to find out if they have additional support needs, to request a specific assessment, to find out if they need a CSP, which is a coordinated support plan, which in Scotland is the legal binding plan. So the local authority has to follow that legally. And they can ask for their coordinated support plan to be reviewed. So requesting a specific assessment, as I kind of touched on before, that could be something for the young person like a real life example is one we had recently, as a young person was really struggling in school with maths. Everything else was kind of okay, but the formulas, the stuff wasn't sticking, and they didn't know. They genuinely were trying really hard. They didn't know what was going on with it, and they put a request into their local authority to say, actually, could I have someone to look at this and see where I need this extra support? And they were able to be diagnosed with dyscalculia, and extra supports are put in place. So that's kind of one of the rights that young people have, to be able to exercise when they're asking their local authority to kind of look into things. Bottom left-hand corner is kind of my part of the job, is that young people have the rights to have their views heard, and they have the right to have support to have that done. So one of the things that we talk about with children and young people at a school meeting is that if you go into a school meeting with a child as, say, a parent or carer, or as a teacher, you know, that can be quite an intense meeting, and there can be, you know, professionals there, perhaps a social worker, perhaps, you know, a link worker or a health professional, a teacher, a pastoral care teacher, a head teacher, you know, and every single one of those people has in common is being an adult. Whereas for a child or young person who the meeting's about and who the additional support needs are about, that can be really, really difficult for them to disagree with something that's been said, or to offer an alternative solution, or to even, you know, speak up when the people that you're in a room with are all adults and experts in their field. And so what we do is support those children and young people to be able to be heard at those meetings, to have someone that's on their side and who understands what things are like for them. So yeah, the right, when a young person turns 12 and they have an additional support need, right through to 15, they have the right to have advocacy for their education issues. In the top right corner, we've got rights to get information or for information to be shared. So young people 12 to 15 have the right to have information about their additional support needs. They have the right to receive a copy of their plans, to be told about decisions that are being made, and to be involved in those decisions. And they have the right to be asked if they're happy for information to be shared when leaving school. So that's where a little bit of transitions planning comes in, where, you know, if a young person is leaving school and going to college, do they want information about their additional support need to be shared wherever they're moving on to? And that's a decision that a young person can make. And then at the bottom, there is the right to be involved in resolving disagreements. So they can ask, young people have the right to ask for independent adjudication, to make reference to an additional support needs tribunal where appropriate. I'll come on in a little bit to talk about My Rights, My Say, how it works, because we have a few different partners, but we do have a project lawyer, a service lawyer that works within My Rights, My Say, and can take on cases that need to be taken to an independent adjudication on an additional support needs tribunal. And young people always have the right to have their views heard during mediation. Now, at the bottom, you'll see that mediation isn't a right that's included for a young person, but they do have the right to still be included within it from the views perspective, sorry. But young people within these rights, I said they were given most of the rights that their parents have. However, they don't get the right to request mediation, to request a change of school or a placing request, and not included their children without additional support needs. But I'm going to just touch on that really quickly, because a lot of the work that we're doing just now is that most children and young people don't see themselves as having additional support needs, because additional support needs and disabilities are different things. An additional support need is exactly as it sounds, and it's any, you know, additional support that's needed for that young person to be able to access their education. So I've kind of drawn up lists here that comes under, you know, different headings. But yeah, we do have, you know, health disabilities, autism, learning disabilities, Down syndrome, ADHD, physical disabilities, hearings, visual motor impairment, health needs, selective mutism. But also there's a lot of other factors that can stop a young person from achieving their potential within school. So family circumstances, being a young carer, being looked after or in care, travelling communities, interrupted learning. And sometimes, you know, being a young carer or being looked after or in care, that can be really crucial to have the support of My Rights, My Say, because they might not have a parent or carer who's able or is as able as other young people to be able to exercise their rights on that young person's behalf. So it's important that young people also get these rights for themselves, and it's really good from an empowerment perspective. But we also have a learning environment, highly able pupils that are learning way above, what they should be. It's important that they're catered to as well. English as a second language, dyslexia, and then you have social and emotional factors. So if someone's experiencing bullying behaviour or displaying bullying behaviour, suffering a bereavement, that's a massive thing for a young person, and any social and emotional behavioural needs. So what I usually say is, if a young person's having a hard time in school and there's something that's not, clicking, or it's not right for that young person, there's usually an additional support need there. And in fact, I had one of my workers phone me the other day to say that her friend contacted over the weekend to talk about their grandchild and say, oh, they're having such a hard time at school, and mentioned 5 or 6 different things that were impacting the young person. And my worker had told them about our projects. No, they don't have an additional support need. And they were like, you've just told me 5 or 6. Like this young person does. And it's about changing that perception of additional support needs. So who does what within My Rights, My Say? Is slightly more complicated than just partners in advocacy. I don't know if you guys have heard of Inquire before, but they're an advice and information service for all sort of additional support needs throughout Scotland. They're grand, and they're a part of My Rights, My Say, and they give onward referrals to ourselves. So there's different parts to the service for a good reason. So we, as partners in advocacy and as part of My Rights, My Say, only support children and young people who wish to exercise their own rights, who want to share their views and exercise these rights in their own stead. So anyone can make a referral, but it's got to be the young person that wants to take this forward and who's, absolutely in partnership with ourselves to, make the best of their school education for themselves. We also have Children in Scotland, who are an independent source to make sure children's views are heard, but in formal processes such as assessments, things like that. So Children in Scotland come into My Rights, My Say when it's a process that's driven by a parental request, such as a placing requestment or mediation. So that's where the young person isn't in the driving seats, but they still, need the opportunity to be able to be heard. And as I mentioned earlier, Cairn Legal is our legal representation to support children, making a reference to the Additional Support Need Tribunal and to give advice within the education system as to, what is legal, what's not, and what's in sort of best interest. So I've talked a little bit about My Rights, My Say and what it does. I am very aware that advocacy isn't something that everyone comes across, every day. And I thought I'd just kind of talk a little bit about why independence is important within advocacy. So what our job is to be independent, is to be a voice for that person. But why is that important? Because we're independent, it means that our only focus in that situation is the person that we are working with, their views and their rights. Our bias is entirely towards that person, their agenda and their desired outcomes. It's what they want. We've got one job and we don't have any conflicts. It's to uphold the rights and ensure the views are heard and respected. And we can sometimes challenge as a professional in a way that might be hard for a family member to do. And it can be really helpful in situations where if a person or family or professionals have conflicting views, so everybody gets heard in their own right, which is great, because that's exactly what you're wanting. So what it is that we do within My Rights, My Say, we take time to build up a relationship with a young person. We don't, jump into it, and we explain a child's rights to support at school, and we do that in a really child-friendly way. And that differs and depends on the young person that we're dealing with, because some young people will understand it no problem at all right off the bat. Some young people need more time. Some young people need it explained in different ways, or through talking mats, or through different expressions of communication. And we tailor our service to the young person that we're working with. We listen to the child, we find out what's important to them and what they want to share with our school. We go to school meetings for them, we stand up for their rights. We empower young people to speak for themselves, and we help them to understand why decisions have been made if they're different to what they wanted. and we explain other options, and we go above and beyond to be able to make sure that the young person has all the options that's open to them. So yeah, I have chatted far too much from slides, and you'll be thinking, SJ, for goodness sake, can you kind of give me an idea of what this is like in real life and stop going on with the guff of the sort of technical bits of it. So I'm going to share a couple, maybe one or two of my own experiences of being an advocacy worker within My Rights, My Say and how it works. So I came across a young person via actually one of my workers. It's their own child who was coming up for 12, and they said, I really think my young person is going to need support from their transition from primary school to secondary school. And that young person was coming up in 12 in the March, and they were already working on a transition plan from primary to secondary. So as soon as they turned 12, I was slightly before 12, I was able to sort of give information and let them know that once they turned 12, that was the age of capacity and they could start exercising their own rights in their own stead. And I started working with that young person, attending meetings, going through the transition planning. On the surface, everything seemed to be absolutely fantastic. High school were promising absolutely everything that primary school weren't. And young person was super excited. The enhanced transition, extra days at high school were going really well. They didn't have anything in particular they wanted me to share at that point, apart from, I need a fresh start, I need people to believe in me, I need the right support. This young person has various different additional support needs, including ADHD, being a looked after, care experienced young person, and later found out dyslexia as well. So it wasn't too long into their transition, actually attending high school, that things started to kind of deteriorate a little bit. And the young person had stated the one thing they wanted all along was someone within the school to go to be able to have a support to share things with and to build that relationships. Relationships are super, super important to this young person, and they like to have a solid ground. Now, the guidance teacher that they had identified and this young person weren't, hitting it off at all. So they actually identified one of their sort of janitor workers, and the young person would spend some time with this worker kind of going around the outside of the grounds, doing things like that. But that worker decided to leave, and this wasn't communicated to the young person, and it broke down really quite quickly. What we had to do was have a meeting with the school, express the young person's views. The school were on about behaviour and not meeting targets when this young person was really in sort of emotional distress and not getting the support that they needed. At that point, we kind of took a step back and looked at the plans. School had to catch up with, the different areas of support and how it should be put in place. And the young person was able to communicate that quite strongly with, this is what I need. When I mentioned earlier about sometimes it can be easier for professionals to communicate rather than family members, that was the case for this young person, in that this young person's mum had already had quite a heated argument quite soon into their transition with the guidance teacher, because they weren't believing the young person. They were behaving not entirely professional towards them, and it was making the parent quite angry. The young person had asked their mum, I need a different guidance teacher, but it wasn't something that mum felt they were able to communicate and be taken seriously. So the young person asked me to go in and make that request, and that was something that we were able to secure for the young person, was a change of guidance teacher after quite a few no's. But we kept going with it. We kept explaining the reasons and the importance to this young person's additional support need of making sure that they had the right support and someone to connect with. And that's what it's about. It's about getting the right support for that young person. And another sort of little nugget from that particular case was this young person had been searching for a CSP. Mum had been applying for it, and they had been continually told that the young person didn't meet the criteria. the first meeting that I went to with 3 pages of this young person's views and how primary school hadn't got it right and how important it was for secondary school to get it right. The decision on the CSP was then taken the next week to grant a CSP to that young person. So there's a lot of power within children and young people's own views, and it coming from them as well as a parent or support. This is just some sort of quotes that we've had from parents and pupils. So it was really empowering for my daughter to know that her voice was being heard and taken seriously. And advocacy really helped me when I was struggling a lot with things at home. It helped ease my stress, having someone to talk to when I was worried. And the teachers were listening. It's much better now, I feel like, in speaking meetings. That's our purpose, is to be able to ensure that young people's rights are being upheld and they're being listened to. This wee slide is just how to get in touch with ourselves if and when you need us, but I've also sent that over to Scott along with some other resources that you guys might be interested in. And I will pass over to Jennifer before my throat gives out, and she can tell you all about her work.
Thanks very much, SJ. That was great. So SJ is going to be operating my slides for me. We've just prepared a combined presentation, so I will be pausing and saying next slide, please, as we go through this. So my name is, oh, go back the way. My name is Jennifer Barr, and I'm the Senior Solicitor within the Education Law Unit at Govan Law Centre. So as a wee description of what we do, we're a national service. We provide legal representation and advice throughout Scotland in terms of parents and carers and young people, those that are 16 and over, in relation to disputes they may have with their education authorities. Next slide, please.
And now when I want it to go to the next slide, it won't. Sorry, Jennifer.
It's fine. Great. So really, as a legal service and solicitors, we focus on the legislation and where the education authorities have failed to uphold their duties and responsibilities under the legislation. And really the main piece of legislation that we look at in terms of education and where all the duties are the Education Scotland Act 1980, which was the original piece of legislation regarding schools, the Standards in Scotland's Schools Act 2000, and as SJ mentioned before, the Education Additional Support for Learning Scotland Act 2004 as amended. And this particularly focuses on additional support needs, as the name suggests. It introduces the idea of CSPs, of placing requests for special schools and transitions. Next slide, please. Great. So parents and carers and young people have a number of rights which you may not know about. The education authorities don't like to advertise the rights that you have as parents and carers and the rights of young people. I think they prefer if they're not bothered and by you, and they can just go on doing what they're doing. So as parents and carers, as it says here, you have the right to request the education established whether your child or young person has additional support needs, and you have the right to receive advice and information on what those additional support needs are of your children. You can request any time a specific type of assessment or examination for the purpose of considering your child's additional support needs, as well as for the education authority to establish if your child has additional support needs and requires a coordinated support plan, or where this plan is being reviewed. Now, a lot of these rights mirror some of the rights that SJ was talking about. So these were the rights that were originally gifted to parents under the education legislation, and then when things were reviewed in 2018, some of these rights were then passed on to children where appropriate. SJ mentioned the coordinated support plan. For those that aren't aware, this is a statutory plan which is a planning tool for education when other agencies such as the NHS and social work are involved with your child and or young person. And it's very important that when you meet the criteria for one, that you receive one, and you should be receiving these automatically. What we find, unfortunately, is often parents and carers that have to request that their child is assessed for a coordinated support plan, whereas the legislation actually says that where you meet the criteria, you should be automatically receiving a coordinated support plan. Parents and carers have the right to request the use of mediation services, and mediation can be very helpful in relation to resolving disputes with your education authority. There is an onus on the education authority to cover the cost of mediation, although all the mediation services and organisations are independent and is separate to the education authority. You have a right to make use of dispute resolution arrangements, the right to make a placing request for your child, and you have a right to be informed of the outcome of any request you make. So that's whether you make a request regarding an assessment, a CSP, a placing request, you must always be informed of the outcome of these requests. Again, moving on, you have the right to request the education authority to establish whether your child needs a coordinated support plan. You should receive a copy of the coordinated support plan, and you should be asked for your views, and they should be taken account and included within the coordinated support plan. You've got a right to refer to the tribunal, and that's the ASN tribunal, which I'm going to come on and speak to a wee bit about as we move on. Matters relating to placing requests, coordinated support plans, and transitions. And there are particular duties on education authorities with respect of transition, which again I'll be coming to shortly. You have the right for a supporter or advocate to be present with you during any meetings with education, and you have the right to a free advocacy service in tribunal proceedings. Again, moving on, I'll move on to discuss that, but that advocacy service is Let's Talk ASN Scotland, which is the service or one of the services we provide within the Education Law Unit at Govan Law Centre. Next slide, please. Okay, so Let's Talk ASN. So this is a national service, and as I mentioned, there's provision for it within the legislation. So it's if you need and meet the qualifying criteria with it for Let's Talk ASN, then we will provide you with representation within the Additional Support Needs Tribunal. So the criteria for Let's Talk ASN is in relation to placing requests. So if you make a placing request to a school and it's refused, we will represent you in appealing that school. Now that school must be a placing request to a special school, to a unit or base within a mainstream school, such as a language and communication base or an autism base. Or if it's a placing request to a mainstream school, your young person or child must have a coordinated support plan in place. If you have a matter relating to a coordinated support plan, either you've requested a coordinated support plan, it's been refused, you disagree with the contents of your coordinated support plan, you feel that the coordinated support plan has not been implemented, the coordinated support plans should be reviewed on an annual basis, and if that's not happened, you have a right to raise this with the tribunal. And finally, the last point, which I've not come across yet, if a coordinated support plan is put in place and you disagree that it should be in place, then you also have the right to raise a reference with the Additional Support Needs Tribunal. And there's also a right which is maybe relevant to a lot of parents and carers listening today. If there's a failure in the transition duties by the Education Authority, then you have the right to raise this with the Tribunal. Moving on, please, next slide. So additional support needs, as SJ mentioned, are different, although often to disabilities, although often or always children with disabilities will have additional support needs. So it's anything which is any child who requires a provision which is additional to or otherwise different from the education provision made generally for children, or as the case may be, young persons of the same age. So that's taken directly from the 2004 Act. And as SJ mentioned, this list is non-exhaustive. It's children with disabilities, health problems, looked after children, children who are young carers, bullied children, children who are experiencing bereavement. So anyone that needs that additional support within education qualifies as having additional support needs. And in fact, the latest statistic is 1/3 of children and young people in schools in Scotland do have recognised additional support needs. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about the Additional Support Needs Tribunal. So the Additional Support Needs Tribunal sits within the first tier tribunal for Scotland, which is part of the Scottish Court and Tribunal Service. So it sits within the first tier tribunal in the Health and Education Chamber. It was previously known as Additional Support Needs Tribunals for Scotland before it was brought into the first tier tribunal in 2018, just around the same time that the children were given the additional rights that SJ mentioned. And as I've said, they hear references and appeals from parents and young people, and also now children who, in respect to the matters that SJ mentioned, against decisions of education authorities regarding educational support. So again, I went through the criteria of what that might look like. Next slide, please. Again, in terms of access in the tribunal, parents and carers can put in their own appeals and references to the tribunal. However, as I mentioned, within the legislation, the Scottish Government do have to provide an advocacy service, and the definition of advocacy service is slightly different from the advocacy service that My Rights, My Say and SJ provide. The advocacy service really is a legal representation. So that's what we do within the Education Law Unit at Govan Law Centre. We provide that legal representation. These education legislation can be quite complicated, and often when we put these matters to the tribunal, you find that the education authorities will use their legal department and their own solicitors to represent them in these appeals. And it can be quite intimidating when parents and carers look to move these matters forward themselves. So we are there to provide that legal representation and advice. We are free, so there is no charge in us taking these appeals forward for you. Next slide, please. Okay, so transitions. I thought I'd say a wee bit about transitions, given that this webinar has been organised by Art Scotland and the Scottish Transitions Forum. So as it says here, the 2004 Act requires education authority to assist young people with additional support, needs to make a successful transition from school to post-school provision. And this is particularly important. And over the last sort of 2 or 3 years, given COVID, I mean, I think transitions have become quite a significant issue, and there's been an increase, certainly from our point of view, in inquiries and cases that we've been moving forward with the Tribunal, where the education authorities have failed to meet their transition duties. So what are the transition duties? Well, within the 2004 Act, their sections 12 and 13 state what the education authorities must do. And that is 12 months before the young person is due to leave school. They must request information from appropriate agencies that are likely to be involved with the child or young person on leaving school. So they've effectively got to reach out, and depending on what the post-school destination is going to look like for the young person, are they going to be moving into supported accommodation? They've got to therefore look and contact various accommodations that might be suitable for that young person. They've got to get in touch with the adult social worker, the transition social worker, and take steps to link up and start to plan for this young person. Then 6 months before the young person is due to leave school, they've got to pass on information to these agencies regarding the child or young person. And that's where they start to pass over, what the child is currently, the support is looking like for the child currently in school, what the input is from the children's social work team, and passing that over to the adult social work team, what is currently the involvement is from NHS, where the child is currently sitting in terms of achievement. Are they achieving are they looking to achieve certain qualifications when they leave school, move on to a supported college placement? And so all this information has to be passed on. Unfortunately, often we find that these timescales are not met by education authorities, which can cause a lot of stress and upset for parents. Whilst children, young people are attending school, the education authority is responsible for their education and for providing all the support that they need. As soon as they stop attending school at the end of for example, their 6th year, there is no more responsibilities sitting with the education authority. And if there isn't a positive destination and a proper transition, these children and young people are likely just to drop off. And they can sort of disappear into the system. So it's essential that proper transition arrangements are carried out. And if there is going to be a gap between finishing school and, for example, a college placement starting, or a delay in supported accommodation being available for that young person, then it's very important that arrangements are put in place in the interim. For example, if there's respite whilst a child, a young person is at school in place, that this will continue until the supported accommodation starts, the placement there starts, or that ongoing support is put in place to continue with a young person's learning until the college placement starts, all circumstance dependent. And this is essential, unfortunately. As I said, during COVID, a lot of these transitions weren't successfully completed. It led to a lot of young people and the parents and carers requesting an additional 7th year at school to allow for the transitions to be completely completed. And that additional year is often a discretionary and up to the education authorities as to whether they will grant that year or not. And so it has been a focus that we've definitely been working on over the last sort of year or two. And sometimes we are successful in achieving successful outcomes. So I hope most of the time we are, and we'll always try our best to do that. Another thing that's very important is throughout the transition process, the education authority should always be seeking the views of the young person. Again, all these processes, all the educational legislation very much places a child or a young person at the centre of all the decision making. And like I said, if the education authority fails in any of the transition duties that are set out within the 2004 Act, you can raise a reference with the Additional Support Needs Tribunal. Next slide, please. Okay, so another piece of legislation with which we work with and the Education Law Unit is the Equality Act 2010, which you may or may not be familiar. So the Equality Act very much focuses around discrimination. We particularly are interested from our point of view in Part 6, which contains all the provision for discrimination within education. Essentially, education authorities cannot discriminate against a pupil for a reason relating to his or her disability or any other protected characteristic. And the definition of a disability in the Equality Act is if a person has a physical or mental impairment, and that impairment has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. And it's also important to highlight here, I think, that a person does not need a diagnosis to have a disability. So it very much focuses on the person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So you essentially, for those young people that are waiting in diagnosis for things like autism for many years, you really need to look at the young person's profile and whether or not and how they're affected in their daily life, as opposed to whether or not they have an official diagnosis. Now, another way of approaching a breach in transition duties may be that you can make a disability discrimination claim to the Additional Support Needs Tribunal, and you can, there's a number of different types of discrimination set out in the 2010 Act, and really the type of discrimination you would be looking at here is a failure to make reasonable adjustments. And what that essentially means is, as someone is disabled, there is a duty on, well, in this case, the Education Authority, to take steps to make reasonable adjustments, to allow that person to have the same chances and opportunities as a non-disabled person. So there's lots of examples of what a reasonable adjustment might be. For example, a reasonable adjustment might be allowing someone in a wheelchair access to a disabled toilet, providing a child with dyspraxia access to a writing board, and having someone support someone at feeding or a personal care. So these are all reasonable adjustments, and it's very much what it says in the tin. In terms of reasonable adjustments, in terms of transitions, that is, if you think about it, it's reasonable for them to carry out their transition duties and to put in a successful and positive post-school destination for that young person, given their disability. And if they're not doing that, very much circumstance dependent, depending on the circumstance of the case, it may be that there is a right to raise a disability discrimination claim. And again, that goes through the Additional Support Needs Tribunal. It's important that it's a disability discrimination claim through the tribunal. Any other type of discrimination relating to your young person, if that's sex, race, religion, belief, etc., they would all go through the Sheriff Court. And next slide, please. So that's it. I hope that was useful, and we're very happy for you to contact us. And we do have a helpline. If you call us at the office and or email us, we are happy to pick up inquiries, to discuss any specific queries with you. And we also have information on our website, templates in terms of requesting assessments, requesting CSPs, requesting mediation, and so on. I would be happy to speak to anyone that's got any questions. Thank you. And I'm now going to pass over to Tracy and Karen, and they can speak to us about their Karen's experiences as a mum. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, SJ. That was really helpful. And I think, you know, for anyone on the call, if you've not actually been aware of the full kind of range of the rights and the entitlements that come through legislation, I think that's a really good overview and a good starting point. I know that people have been putting questions in the Q&A. Please keep on doing that while Karen and I are talking, and there'll certainly be time to come to those at the end. That's great. So first of all, for anyone who hasn't met me, my name's Tracy Francis, and I work for Uncrc Scotland for the Scottish Transitions Forum. And one of my roles with the forum is to run our Parent and Carers Network, which is a small but growing group of parents across the whole of Scotland who've got young people at all sorts of different stages of the transition journey, from within school at the moment, through that transition couple of years, and then on into young adulthood. And one of the things that we try and do is share information. We try and connect people together, and we try and make sure that the voices of parents and carers are heard loud and clear in the discussions and the debates around transitions as well, because we think it's really important that actually the view of the family as a whole is represented. Everything is about putting the young person at the centre and getting the best for them and making sure that everything is as it should be, but it's recognising that there are other people who are part of that, and parents and carers have got a really strong role to play. So that's me. Karen, I'm just going to ask you if you wouldn't mind, do you want to introduce yourself and just say a wee bit about your situation at the moment?
Yeah, certainly. So my name's Karen Mckenzie. I am a single parent and a parent carer of an amazing young man. I have now learnt to call him a young man, not a child, because he's 20 now. He has a diagnosis of autism. He also has quite severe anxiety, which is more of an issue, more of a challenge for him in his life than specific autism traits might have been. He had a rocky road through education. It has to be said, it didn't always go smoothly, but what's come out of the end of education, as I say, is an amazing young man I'm incredibly proud of, who goes out into the world and does what he wants to do when he can manage to do it. And I've worked with Tracy now for several years. I've been involved mainly because I firmly believe in talking and telling people, you know, our story, all the bits that were bad, but the bits that were good at the end of it as well, because that's what's helped me a great deal. When my wee man was 5 years old and first started having issues, it was other parent carers that kept me sane, that kept me thinking, actually, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and no matter how bad this feels now, I will find a way through it to do the best for him. And that's what we've done. That's why I took on a role with a charity up here called Thriving Families that support families in the Highlands with a child with an additional support need, was to give a little bit back and to make sure that we're there for other parent carers, because I know what a dark place it can feel and how lonely it can feel. So that's why I'm here.
That's brilliant, thank you. And I know from what we've been saying today, rights obviously are fundamental to a lot of the things that, we know are good, and it's good practice, it underpins good practice. But there's an awful lot, we've heard a lot about rights within education and accessing education, but it actually goes wider than that as well, doesn't it? It goes into things like the support that someone has, the people who are involved in delivering that support, how that works. Karen, I wonder if you would say a little bit about, what do rights mean to you, maybe in the past, but also now that your son is moving on into young adulthood. How has that changed? What do rights mean to you? And what experience have you had of exercising those?
I think the main thing for me, I always find it fascinating to listen to the likes of SJ and Jennifer, because I never felt that I was 100% sure exactly what his rights were or what my rights were. But I always went into everything I did with him on the assumption that he's a human being. He has the same rights as any other human being, but he also has the right to a reasonable adjustment to make allowances for his disability. But I also have rights. And I think sometimes not knowing specifically is quite a good thing, because it doesn't stop you asking. I went into everything with education with, this is what my young man needs, this is what I'm asking for. And if somebody says no, well, they're going to have to back up why it's a no. And as we'll all know, very often with education, it's resources. We don't have money, we don't have people. And for me, that was never an acceptable reason for him not to be able to have something that he needed. We may not always get exactly what we want, but I think the important thing is to have that kind of in your back pocket, that if asking nicely isn't going to get me what he needs, then I can go a step further. And we did use the Govan Law Centre a couple of times when I was asking and asking and asking, and I wasn't getting anywhere, and he was still struggling for it. But for me, the most important thing is he has the right to live his best life as best as he can, and nobody has the right to take that from him. There are things he will always struggle to do, but he has the right to have whatever support he needs to access those. But as well as that, I have the right to have a life as well. I would give up anything for him. I'm his mum. I will always support him. But I've always felt if I want him to have his best life, I have to model me having my best life. And that is a difficult balance to get, because his best life, if you were to ask him, is he stays at home, he plays on his computer, and he never has to interact with a human being apart from his mother ever again. Lockdown was his idea of heaven, until 2 years later, after we'd been shielding, when actually he discovered that as a teenage boy, being stuck with your mother gets a bit boring because she's not that exciting after a while. And while I appreciate that's what he wants, I couldn't live my life like that. I needed to have more than that. And in my heart, I knew he wanted more than that, because actually he's a really sociable young man. He loves people. He loves to chat to people. He's like me. Once you get him started on a subject he's interested in, you'll never get him to shut up. So I knew he needed more than that. So when issues we had with education, well, he's not great with people, so we'll keep him in a room on his own with just one other person. I knew that wasn't what was right for him. I knew that wasn't what was best for him. And I knew they weren't listening to what he was saying, because he was saying he wanted to be with other people. His voice wasn't being heard. And at that point, I had to be his voice, because if they weren't going to listen to him, I knew he would back off straight away when people didn't listen to him. And he would just say, oh, well, yeah, life's just a bit rubbish and you don't get what you want. What's the point in trying? I'm slightly more bolshy than he is, and I don't take no for an answer. And when you're fighting for your child, it's very difficult for people to tell you you're wrong, because I knew I was right. And in the end, we slowly built things up. And by the time he left school, he was having an amazing time. He had a small class. We were very fortunate to get him into specialist school, so there wasn't this huge classroom of 30 pupils that he couldn't cope with. He was in a group of 6 or 7 pupils, but they moved about the school and they interacted with other classes and they interacted with the office and they went to the canteen, which he'd never been allowed to do till he was about 15. But because we kept pushing that he might not look like he wants to do this, but that's because he's frightened to try to do it. And I think that was what was important to me to get across to people. It's his right to his best life. And that's not what we decide it will be. And sometimes it's understanding the difference between him saying no, meaning, no, I really don't want to do that and I'm not interested, and him saying, no, I'm actually terrified to try that and I need support to do it, and knowing when to push that. And I think that's where, as parent carers or any carer for a young person, we come in as being their voice, as ensuring that actually what they get is the best they want, not the best they feel they can manage, because the best he feels he can manage isn't the best that he actually wants.
I think there is something there, isn't there, about who's best placed to say, because, you know, I've been part of discussions where, and I'm sure, you know, people on the call will have been as well, where the young person is saying one thing and somebody else, perhaps in the family or perhaps outside the family, is saying something a little bit different. Do you have any thoughts about how you actually navigate that? How do you decide whose voice is going to be listened to, where there's a conflict, if you like, if it's a bit of a disagreement around that?
I think the important thing is to have somebody that the young person trusts. And for us, that was quite easy. It was me and my son, because there's just the two of us at home and we're together all the time. And I could have those conversations with them that were a little bit difficult. We could have them in a a more relaxed environment, because when you're in school trying to have a conversation about what's going wrong in school, you're already, your shoulders are up, you're a wee bit tense, you're a wee bit worried, and I can see that with my young man, that when he's anxious, he's not going to maybe tell you the truth. And I think it's identifying somebody that the young person trusts, and I think that's where things like with SG and advocacy, that can be amazing for a young person if they've got someone they trust like that. For my son, that would be really difficult because he doesn't trust people apart from me and maybe his grandpa, you know, and his cat who's just come in for a wander about. But that's a really difficult thing to do. And there are people within school that he trusts now, but that takes such a long time to do. And I think that's where, I mean, we went for guardianship for him when he was coming up for 16. And I wasn't too sure because I kind of thought, he's very verbal, he's quite bright, he doesn't have a learning disability in any way, he just has difficulty communicating with people, mainly because he doesn't want to. And I think when guardianship was first suggested to me, I kind of thought, really, at 16, does he need that? And then when I stopped and thought about it, I thought, yes, because it's not about me having guardianship and doing it for him. It's about him having the confidence that he can do things. But if he really can't, the guardianship is in place and I can step up and help him or support him, or in the end, just do something for him if he can't. I mean, examples of his guardianship. If he needs a doctor's appointment, he will not pick up the phone and make a doctor's appointment because he doesn't know what they'll ask him when he phones. I do that for him, but I do it with him sitting next to me. So I'm doing that. And I think that's the most important thing about getting his rights heard, is that he has someone he trusts. And when we went through the guardianship process and they spoke to him about why he wanted a guardian and what mattered to him, he's like, I just want, if I can't do it, I want mum to do it because I trust her. He said, I might not always like what she makes me do, but I know she's doing it for the right reasons, which, you know, let's be honest, he doesn't actually want to eat vegetables, but his mother makes him. He'd prefer not to have to brush his teeth some days, but his mother makes, you know, all those things. But he could also see it in the bigger scheme of things. When it comes to his finances, he wants me to be the one that can say, actually, no, you can't spend that money because you need it for something else that you've put it aside for. And I think that can be quite hard, with, especially within education, and when you're transitioning out of child services and into adult services, and there's that change, because they're no longer a child and you want to give them as much independence as possible. But you also want to be sure that they are making the decisions they actually want to make, not the decisions they feel they have to make. For us, he didn't get hugely involved in the actual meetings that we did around transition. But before every meeting, I sat with him and told him what I was going to bring up and what I was going to be discussing. And then asked for his input. And we'd spoken about what he wanted when he left school for years. I mean, before he even transitioned from primary to secondary school, we had a vague plan of what he enjoyed and what he didn't enjoy. So we were going into those meetings, and I genuinely feel his voice came through my voice because there had been the conversation. And I could say, if someone came up with someone suggested in one of the meetings a venue that might be good for him, and I said, we've spoken to him about that and he is not up for it, he's not interested, he won't talk, he won't engage, he will not even go and look at it, I think we need to just take that off the table, because there's no point in wasting time on something that he will not engage with. And I think that's a good thing, and I think it's something that the other professionals outside of the parent carers, because I class myself as a professional in my son, 20 years 24/7 with him, I am the best at knowing him. But I think it's good for those other professionals to have that and to use that, because it can make your life so much easier if you actually put the child's rights first anyway. These young people should be at the centre of everything we do, and that's what their rights give them. If we're doing that from the get-go, it is easier. And I think, to be honest, I think a lot of the time education just did what I wanted because it was the easiest way to shut me up and get me to go away, because I don't give up. I won't accept no, we've never done that before, as a suitable reason for not doing something. But actually, and I hope they did then use that with other, in fact, I know they did use that with other families, of actually it is easier if we listen to this and we take this on board and we build on it to actually build something worthwhile for this young person going forwards. And I think a lot of the professionals are probably like me, they don't actually know the nitty-gritty and the legalities of what the rights are, but that shouldn't matter, because if we're putting what's best for the child at the heart of what we do, you're never going to have to exercise your rights, because that's what the rights are there to provide. So it's getting that balance of the two things together. And I think for us, we were very lucky that my son and I are very close, and we have a really good relationship, and we can talk about anything and everything. And that makes that easier for me to probably advocate on his behalf. We probably would never need to use someone like Partners in Advocacy, because he trusts me to talk for him, and I have the confidence to talk for him, and I have the bullshit attitude not to back down and not to be intimidated by, I mean, the very first multidisciplinary meeting I went to, there was 8 people on one side of the table and 1 chair on the other side of this big table for me to sit at. And I just walked in on my own and thought, nah, it's not happening, and took the chair and went round and sat at the head of the table and went, right, I'll sit here, thank you. And because that's just the kind of person I am. I'm not, I'm not going to back down from a fight if it's about getting what's right for my young man. But I think not all parents are that confident, and there's a lot of parent carers I've spoken to that have said, oh, but it just never happens. And that's where they then need to know their rights, and knowing that you're in the right gives you that confidence to say, well, no, I'm sorry, but that, the fact that you don't have a teacher that can do this is not my child's problem, it's your problem, you're going to have to find one.
I think that's really important, isn't it? And it's recognizing, you were talking there about the knowledge and the understanding of the relationship with the young person, whether it's a parent, whether it's somebody else they trust, but that long-standing relationship, to be able to genuinely see, not just, this is the snapshot in front of us, this is a case file that's on the desk, but this is a person who's got a rounded life, who's got, a life outside education, who's got a life as part of a family, a social life, whatever, and seeing that bigger picture, and making sure that everybody, and that includes parents and carers, have such a wealth of knowledge that they need to bring to the table as part of actually discussing what someone's rights are, to be able to uphold them effectively. I want to leave time for questions, because I'm fairly sure that there will be some more coming through in the Q&A. The one thing I just wanted to ask you to finish off with, Karen, is we know that you have guardianship. Have you ever had any situations where you've struggled to exercise guardianship, or where you've had to, that hasn't been accepted, or any experience around that?
I haven't particularly. We've been quite lucky. His financial stuff, when we set up his bank account as he became an adult and moved from having a child's bank account to an adult's, I didn't quite have guardianship in place. So I just went in and spoke to our bank branch. And I was really lucky. I got a really nice girl, and she's like, look, we can do all the forms, you and me together, and then all he'll have to do is actually sign one. Will he manage to do that? And I'm like, yeah, that'll be fine. As it turned out, when he went in to sign the form, he knew her anyway, because she went to the same board game club that he goes to, and it was all fine. But that was easy enough. And ever since then, every time we've just recently renewed for another 3 years, I just take a photocopy of the form from the Office of the Public Guardian into the bank. They photocopy it, they put it on his file. I've done the same with the doctors, I've done the same with his hospital, and they've all been quite happy that they've got an up-to-date one and that they'll speak to me. They would prefer to speak to him, and I think they should speak to him, but they're happy to speak to me to make an appointment. And I go to his appointments with him, but I try and step back and have him do the talking as much as possible. The only issue that we have had is when applying for benefits for him, because he didn't go into education. And you have to go through the whole spiel with the Department of Work and Pensions about being his appointee. And it's like, I've got a bit of paper from a court that says I'm in charge of his finances. Why isn't this enough? That's very frustrating. But again, it's not a particularly difficult process to go through. It's a few forms and they ask a few questions. And if you've gone through the guardianship process, it's nothing really becoming an appointee. There's much less questioning that goes into that. That's the only bit that really annoys me about it, is that once you've got it, a couple of places still have to question whether you're the right person to do this. And
so life would be just that little bit easier if there was
Yeah.
kind of recognition, better understanding of what that's there for.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
if it was more accepted, and I think sometimes that I've had a couple of parents say, oh, we don't want guardianship because it's not up to us to dictate what our children do. And I think that understanding that's not what guardianship's for. Guardianship's a safety belt so that when they can't do something, you can do it for them. I always use the example, if my son falls out of a tree and breaks his leg, he will say, no, I don't want any treatment for it, because he'll be terrified at that stage. I have guardianship. I can step in and say, actually, yes, you are going to set it and put it in a cast so he can walk again. That's what it's there for. It is not there for me to say, you will do this or you will do that. It's there when he can't manage what's best for himself, or when he just can't make a decision, because that's something you'll find with people with autism. Sometimes the head goes down, the hands can't. I can't make a decision, you have to do it for me. And that's when having guardianship means that I can.
That's lovely. Thank you, Karen. That's brilliant. Scott, I'm going to hand back over to you. I think, I don't know if there are any more questions coming through the Q&A, or any questions for Karen, for Jennifer, for SJ. Quite happy to tackle anything that's coming through. So over to you. Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. That was really, really good. All of you have been amazing. It's a lot to download, I think, in an hour and a half, because rights is vast and huge, and a huge topic. One thing that we should point out, I think, and talk about is timeliness as well. These processes can sometimes take time. And the reason why we are doing it just before the schools go back is for the people who are here. You're aware of the processes, and don't be shy in making noise if you feel things aren't working up front, rather than waiting like 6 months down the road, because then you've only got 3 months to kind of fix things, and time gets short. So don't be afraid of making waves from the very beginning, I think is my advice to people. But thank you all. I'm going to go through the questions in the Q&A stuff. And
while you're having a quick look through, can I just say, I just picked up one question, one comment there that somebody had commented that sometimes an advocate with your child's voice is more powerful than a parent, no matter how able the parent. And I think that's absolutely true. That's a really important point to make. Because just as you were saying there, Karen, there's plenty of parents who will be out there campaigning for their young people, but sometimes you just need that extra person there on your side. And it could be because it might be because they have knowledge of a system that you don't actually have, and the same level of understanding, or it might just be having somebody to look at something from an objective point of view, because this is speaking from personal experience, but when you're emotionally involved in a situation, then the emotions can take over no matter how articulate you are, and having somebody there on your side who can just speak for you is really, really important. So absolutely, I would just echo that and say that's really important.
I agree. Yeah, no, it's a really important comment. There have been times where there have been lawyers with young people who've had additional support needs, disabilities, human rights lawyers, who are, you'd think, on it, but they want to sit and be in a meeting as a parent. They don't want to sit in a meeting and be a lawyer. So yeah, don't be afraid to kind of get support when you need it. And same for the young people. I think it's very, very important. And it's kind of Tracy Campbell's question that I wanted to put to the panel first. Tracy was mentioning that, so it's kind of like there's a bit of context and then the question. So for Tracy, for their coordinated support plan, Tracy was told that this was specifically if you have multiple agencies involved at one time. So even although we were getting input from children's and adolescents mental health services, and their daughter was seeing a pediatrician yearly, the school removed the coordinated support plan when we moved off of active caseload of speech and language therapy, and their daughter is non-verbal. So the question that Tracy was asking is, Like, surely with those involvements, CAMS, paediatrician, and others, that that should have been enough to keep the coordinated support plan in place. I guess this is like one for SJ and Jennifer. I don't know which one of you wants to take this up.
I can start, Jennifer, if you want to then follow on with anything I've missed. Yeah, ideally, I think the issue sometimes with coordinated support plans is because it's significant engagement from another agency. So if it's CAMS or NHS or social work, there has to be a significant input. So if a service withdraw or you go then to outpatients, you know, or the appointments become more sporadic, a local authority can withdraw because there isn't then that support to coordinate. So there has to be the two agencies. And the difficult thing is that the own agencies themselves, it's not the local authority that that says whether their input's significant, it's the own agencies themselves. And sometimes, especially agencies such as CAMS are reluctant to say they're significant, because then once it's in the CSP, legally they have to abide by that. If they say that they need to see the young person once every 2 weeks, no matter the staff shortages, no matter what's going on within their own internal organisations, that is in law that has to happen because it's within that plan. And so then it's almost making a rod for their own backs, but then saying that they're significant and sticking to these very specific things that are within the plan, because it's an internal stress. So sometimes agencies that are feeling the pressure won't describe their input as significant, but that can be challenged through, you know, going through the additional support needs tribunal, etc. Sorry, Jennifer, I've probably missed loads out of that, but
no, that is good. So yeah, I think the problem is with the sort of qualifying criteria for a coordinated support plan is it says that you require significant additional support to be ongoing for at least a year, and there's no definition within the legislation as to what significant means. So there's been lots of case law, you know, court decisions that have tried to sort of work out what they mean by significant. The significant really, ultimately it shouldn't really be decided by the agencies. It's really down to the sort of legal test and the education authority in the first place to decide whether it's significant. And if it goes to tribunal, it would then be the tribunal as an independent, you know, a decision maker to look at the definition to decide whether it's significant. What you can have is you can have multiple different departments within the NHS. So you can have CAMS, speech and language, OT, all the different sections within the NHS. And although they might have smaller amounts of involvement cumulatively, it can be seen as significant. So although you might, you know, it might be significant if you're seeing CAMS, you know, every 4 weeks or every 6 weeks. If you're seeing CAMS every 2 months, you're seeing speech and language therapy every, you know, 2 months, and there's lots of smaller, like drawn out input from various NHS input agencies, then that qualifies together as a significant input from the NHS. I mean, it'd be really interesting to maybe speak to Tracy and get more details on our specific circumstances, and you know, would welcome her to get in touch with us directly, and we can just discuss with her you know, the specifics to her situation and give her some more individualized advice.
That is great, Jennifer. So Tracy, just to remind everyone, I'm going to bundle all of the resources and links and everything together in an email that will go out to everyone who has signed up to attend. So you'll be able to reach out to Jennifer directly, and Tracy says thank you. So that is good. Next question. I'm going to skip the one and then we're going to go to the next one because this one's pretty straightforward, and then we'll go back to the anonymous question. Do partners in advocacy provide advocates for children or parents for healthcare issues?
You would hope that question would be really straightforward, but it's not. Partners in Advocacy provide lots of different services in lots of different areas, and it's entirely dependent on funding, I'm afraid. So Partners in Advocacy are a charity organisation, and we have lots of different funders. So some of our funding comes from Scottish Government, some comes from local authorities who are investing within their, local authority. Some comes from, pots of funding like lottery funding, etc. At the moment, it would depend on what area you're within. For if it's so for example, we've got great coverage in East Wren and Dundee. We've unfortunately lost a project in Glasgow which dealt with all childhood adverse experiences or young people going through difficult situations recently, but the best thing I can advise is to get in touch with us, because if we can't take it on, we'll be able to look about and see if there's someone else, because we've got a wide knowledge of the different advocacy providers, and we'll be able to have a look and see who would be best placed to support yourself or your child.
That's brilliant. Thank you, SJ. So yeah, funding specific, like everything at the moment, I think as well, we're all kind of at the mercy of that. Second anonymous question, and I've been reading this question and thinking myself, I'm not sure if this is one that we can answer here. Has there been an identified impact of the change in the school nursing strategy or education health team that is described in the Scottish Government guidance from 2017? I can't comment, so I'm going to open it to anybody on the panel that might be aware of this.
It's not something that I have any knowledge about, I'm afraid, Scott. I think it's something that it's a really interesting question to ask, and I think it would be well worth exploring, but it's not something that I can actually comment on at the moment. I don't know, Jennifer, were you about to come in and say something?
I was just about to say something similar to you, Tracy. It's not something I know or have come across, but definitely be happy to look into it and provide some feedback to the questioner if they want to get in touch with us.
I am kind of guessing that because we don't have an answer to that, the answer may well be no. But yes, certainly, yeah, I would say happy to explore that and come back to, it's the anonymous attendee, isn't it? I'm happy to explore that and come back if we can.
Yeah, I was going to say there's the same thing. So obviously there's the kind of move towards including health within education, and that is a key part of transition, and I understand that strategy is existing. But again, Tracy, just to reflect, if we're not hearing about it, maybe it's either I'm not connected enough into the health kind of element of stuff, or it's maybe not reaching where it needs to reach at this point. Don't know, but it's definitely one I have bookmarked and will be looking at this afternoon. So thank you for even raising it. It's really good. Finally, this is maybe a kind of comment rather than a question, but I still think is useful to talk about, and it's from Catherine. And Catherine says, in Glasgow, transitions are failing not due to education but due to social work. They just can't cope with the workload. I wonder if a coordinated legal approach would be beneficial rather than individual approach. So there is a question in that. Defending a legal case is basically a massive cost to the taxpayer, which ultimately leads to less services. Essentially, we need better funding from the Scottish Government. I wonder how much Glasgow City Council are spending in education legal fees. So I guess the question for that is like, I think maybe a coordinated legal approach. Jennifer and Sarah, like, and Karen even, have you ever had like a group of parents that have come together to be like, you need to improve your services or linkages between services or something similar?
I think so. When we take on these cases, our aim is never to, well, we would hope that they can always be resolved, and we always encourage our clients to look at mediation and communicate with the education authorities, because I mean, and we do have a lot of cases that are resolved and compromises met, or you find that the education authorities will change their mind, and you know, sometimes they just don't have the full set of facts in front of them. So that is always our priority. You know, we don't go into these things you know, guns blazing, we're going to take you to tribunal or to court. That's definitely not how we approach them. Unfortunately, we do have the cases that end up there that just can't be resolved. And I think in terms of the resources being spent by education authorities, and I think particularly you mentioned Glasgow there, I agree they can be excessive. Sometimes I suppose they can get quite stuck in their position and with things like refusing to put extra resources in place for a transition, and they just become quite we're not doing it, and then they don't want to back down, and they, you know, and despite all the evidence being that they should, and the decision's going to go against them, they just like to get stuck in there and not move and not change their position. And yes, it takes a lot of time, a lot of resources, and you know, parents, young people, children are entitled, they have these rights, and when their rights are breached, they do have these remedies, and it's very important to encourage everyone, you know, first of all, to be aware of what their rights are, and to be able to use you know, the remedies that are available for them. So we would never discourage people from using their rights and you know, moving forward where they've been breached. So that's also important to note as well. It's just really there, perhaps it's within the authorities that they need to put more work in terms of you know, trying to resolve things and looking at things a bit more logically, and being a bit more proactive in terms of considering cases and reaching resolution. In terms of the failure and the facts coming from social work, yeah, you can find that a lot of the difficulties are maybe the other agencies involved with the transitions. However, ultimately, whilst a young person is still enrolled at school, all the legal duties to complete the transition, have everything in place, sit with school and education, and there's no onus on social work to complete that. So it really has to be the school education that are held accountable to make sure that transition is successful. So though there are resource difficulties with social work, ultimately the person responsible and managing that is education.
Karen, can I just ask, because you did refer to you know, the idea that when you're exercising your rights, excuse me, it improves things for all of us. You know, it's not just about getting the right thing for your young person, it's about improving things for other parents, other carers, other young people that are coming along as well. Do you have any examples, or do you have any views around people coming together as a group to be able to maybe apply a little bit of pressure in that kind of respect?
I think where we've been successful here in the Highlands has been when parent carers and families have come together. And when I say parent carers, I don't just mean mums and dads. I mean mums, dads, grannies, grandpas, neighbours, aunties, uncles, other teachers have all come together to say the same thing. Because very often we found you go to education and say, look, this is failing. And they're like, oh, well, we didn't know, no one had told us before. And you're tearing your hair out going, well, I can list 10 other parents off the top of my head who've said the same. So what's worked, I think, has been when they've come together and put a weight of evidence for why something isn't working the way it is. And it worked. There've been a number of campaigns up here about the amount of pupil support assistants have been in schools and things. But from a very personal point of view, after I had kind of gone to Govan Law and suggested maybe if they weren't going to play ball, a CSP was what I was going to need to get them to review. He didn't need a CSP. I knew he didn't need a CSP because we didn't have other services involved, but putting them on the spot and making them review what they were doing changed the way they dealt with me going forwards, and changed the way they dealt with some other families, because it was a case of, oh, actually we hadn't actually thought that if we just do this, it's actually easier, and we get to where we want to go without jumping through hoops. And part of you goes, how could you not see that? But we've all been there where we can't see the wood for the trees. So I think his school treated things slightly differently. I think after a few parents, and not just me, a few parents had kind of gone, no, I'm not taking this anymore. You're not this is his rights and you have to do it. They actually changed their approach to the way, even just the way meetings were held. We changed from going into meeting going, right, well, let's look at everything that's gone wrong, to going into meetings going, right, what's been going right? All right, these things are working. Let's use what's working about this to try and make his transition work when he comes out. Let's use the things that are working in school, that are making him happy and healthy and involved in school, and tell the people he's going to be working with when he transitions what these things are, so that they can have them in place. And that was the most important thing, because that changed the whole conversation from education telling social work all the things he can't do and all the things they're going to have to put in place to deal with the things he can't do, to telling social work, actually, he can do all of these things if you just get to know him and let him have his space. And it changed the way social work dealt with us, because they then kind of went from going, we don't have the resources to do anything for him, to actually going, but you're not asking for a person to work with them, you're just asking for funding for a placement you've already found. And I was like, yeah, I've been saying that for a year. And they were like, oh yeah, we can do that. And that, I think, it was great for him because he got the placement he needed, but it was also great for all of us involved with him, because instead of just being like rams butting horns with me going, but he needs, and them going, but we don't have resources, and me going, but he needs, we were all actually going, oh, actually, we've just answered the question. This is what he needs. This is how it's been provided. This is who's providing it. Happy days. And I think that's important for people to see, that you can make that kind of change. And I know from speaking to parents whose children have transitioned out of that school since he left, that approach is still being used, probably not universally, but by a lot of the professionals within the education, of look at what's working and how can we have that in place when they've left school as well. Let's take what's working and make it keep working, instead of looking at, let's look at what might go wrong and put something in place to deal with that. And it's just made the whole thing friendlier more than anything.
I think that's a really encouraging kind of takeaway message, isn't it? And it's the fact that actually it doesn't necessarily take huge amounts of resource. There will be some young people for whom that is the case, but for a lot of people, it can make an enormous difference just by making some of those cultural shifts. I think that's a really encouraging example. Thanks, Karen.
Yes, Liam, I know you've had your hand up for ages. Have we got time for like a very brief question if I let Liam ask? Liam, I'm going to allow you to talk. So I feel like such a school governor. If you want to unmute yourself, yeah.
There we go, brilliant, thank you. It was just a kind of quick comment on, I work for CHAS, so Children's Hospice across Scotland, and I'm the transition worker there. And I work across a number of different local authorities. And I think when we're looking at the failure of, some people say it's education, some people say it's social work, for me, transitioning our kids, all the kids I work with need external support. So they need support once they leave school to carry out whatever it is within the next stage. And there's a huge crisis, as everybody here will probably know, in social care services at the minute for staffing. So the biggest barrier coming across for the children and families that we work with is trying to source providers who have staff within time that can support the children going forward. And that's the huge barrier at the minute, because I think everyone that I'm working with, and when agencies are coming together, it's great because we're coming together. There's plans in place, we're getting it right for the children and young people that we support. However, we're unable to move to that next step and progress anywhere because there isn't enough people anymore within social care. And it seems to be a huge, massive barrier that we're coming across, that we can't find the people to support the children, young people that need the support out there. And I think that's something that needs to be escalated up and above us today and up above everyone kind of sitting here, that it's you know, I think we often point fingers to our social workers because they're close to us, or you know, our education system because they're the closest in there who are responsible for putting us forward to that next stage. But when there's no one out there to take the next steps, especially when we're looking at the group between 18 to 30, that big transition age, there isn't a lot out there for the children, young people and young adults in that age. It's trying to find the services out there. That seems to be our biggest barrier at the minute.
Yeah, Liam, you're not alone. It is a really a bleak vista, if you like, or environment at the moment in terms of post-COVID, post-austerity, stepping into another recession. Like it's on ongoing and endless. And we don't have an answer to that. All we do is we have processes and situations where we can advocate for that across the work that we do. And it's something, and I know especially in children who have life shortening conditions, the transition is vital, because it sounds a bit bleak, but who knows how long they're going to be living once they kind of move out of services. So you want them to move into the services that are going to support them as young adults as fast as possible, so they can live the life that they deserve to live. And I totally appreciate that. And it's a message that we've heard across the whole of everywhere we work, actually. I think is this whole, like, the process could be amazing, the plans could be immaculate, but then if you come out the other end of it and everyone's done what they've done and there aren't the services to support them, like, what's the point with that? And it sounds a bit bleak, and I don't want to end a webinar on that point, but it is very real for people. But there are very real solutions being created by people through, like, self-directed support and these kind of things, but still I don't necessarily feel it's bridging that gap. And I guess when we think about these things like the National Care Service Review and all of this, it's designed to look at all of this again and again to make it better. But yeah, this is a message that we do pass up the chain constantly. And I do know, because of the lack of services people are experiencing, this is being put onto other areas of places that shouldn't be providing the support that they are. And they're also pushing this back up the chain. What can we do about these lack of services and lack of people on the ground? Because from that, all relationships suffer, you know. And that's one of the things, Karen, I think you were talking about, and Jennifer and Sarah, SJ, is the relationships are really, really important. And if people don't have space for that, it gets even bleaker, doesn't it? Anyway, I didn't want to necessarily end on like that kind of note, but thank you, Liam. I think it's really, really important. And as the Scottish Transitions Forum, we do, just to reassure you, put this back up the line. We report everything. Sorry, it makes me sound like a spy, but we report everything that our members say to us through the different Scottish Government and strategic channels. So we're always representing your voice at all of these different places. And this is one message that we've been talking a lot about. So thank you for that. I don't know if anybody wants to come in on Liam's comment, or...
I think one thing that can mitigate it very, very slightly is to think outside the box. The amount of opportunities my son's had that have come from him saying, I want to do that, and everyone around him going, oh, I don't know, and me going, well, if he wants to, he will. For example, flying lessons. You know, for a child who couldn't sit an exam because he'd never been educated, he's learning to fly, he's going to be a pilot. That's an extreme example. You know, I phoned our local theatre and got him work experience because he wanted to see what it was like to work behind the scenes. There are options, and I think sometimes knowing that social care services are so inundated with work and don't have the time to go and find these other options, if you can find someone, or you can do that yourself, that can maybe find them, it might just ease that burden a little bit. And believe me, if you go to social work and say, I've already done all the research, this is exactly what is out there, this is exactly what it will cost, they will practically kiss you because you've made their life a little bit easier.
Yeah, we're in it together and thinking outside the box. That's good advice. Yeah, I think we're 12 minutes over schedules, and I know people have other places to be. So I'm going to just say thank you for everyone that's come along. The recordings and all of the resources will be made available post the webinar. And I just want to say an absolutely huge thank you to SJ, Jennifer, and Karen, in no particular order. You've been amazing, and thank you so much. And you're all very much welcome just to, like, hold on to the end of the webinar for a couple of minutes just to check out. And I will pass all of your details over to people that have attended the webinar if they want to reach out to you with any questions. So on that note, thank you so much. And everyone that's attended today, thank you. And please enjoy the really, really hot weather. I'm actually sitting with the blinds down. That's why I look like I'm in the dark. And I'm melting. My ankles are sweating. So on that note, I'll let everyone go. And thank you so much for attending. And if the rest of you just want to hang on for a couple of minutes, that would be great. Yeah, I think that's everyone has gone away. I think there's
Is
like
there six people?
there's like an attendee that's on the list but doesn't exist on the list, which is really weird. Like there's no one on the list, but they're saying that there's somebody on the list.
All right, okay.